Okay, good morning, Dad.
Good morning.
Today is Wednesday, January 15th, and let's start by talking about this Israel-Hamas ceasefire deal. Is this real? Is this actually happening?
Well, I believe it is. Of course, the deal hasn't been made yet, but there is such a flurry of reports from varied and reliable sources, that a deal is imminent, and I think that we have to believe that it is indeed imminent.
How and why is this happening?
Well, there are different explanations that are provided. Haaretz has pointed to two things. And one was actually some extreme pressure from the incoming administration, in other words, Trump's administration. But the other, which I think is probably the decisive factor, is that uh, Netanyahu has brought in some other coalition partners, and he's not completely dependent on the extremists. We're talking about Smotrich and Ben Gvir, because in the past they've always been against these deals, and so even if Netanyahu was maybe willing to go ahead with one of them, he couldn't afford to lose them because his whole government would collapse. But according to this Haaretz report that I just saw yesterday, that's just not true anymore. It's a different calculus. Once again, Smotrich and Ben Gvir are saying that we're going to quit if you go ahead and make reach some kind of ceasefire agreement with Hamas. But now apparently that's something. I'm sure that Netanyahu doesn't want to lose them, but he can, and he can. Apparently, he can now survive without them. So
Does
those are
that
two factors, anyway, that I've heard that have been put forth. And then I guess on the Hamas side, um, you know, well, I mean, they've suffered terribly. Uh, they put up an amazing fight. I mean, just I think in the last week or two, the IDF has lost another 15 soldiers in places that they claimed that they had actually taken control of, and clearly they haven't. Hamas continues to fight back. They were trying to clear all of northern Gaza, and they just haven't succeeded in doing it. So, um, but
so? If Netanyahu isn't worried about losing the support of people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich, does that mean that there's been a change within Israeli society? That there's now that's kind of reflecting that maybe a bit of rationality, that they realize that, hey, this is not good for Israel. Israel is beginning to suffer terribly. I mean, there's the losses themselves, but economically they're suffering. And maybe the bloodlust is starting to subside a little bit from more Israelis, and that's why they're
that's
willing to do a deal.
possible. I haven't seen any evidence of that. I'd have to see some polling data. Um, there always has been a fairly powerful pro ceasefire faction within Israeli politics. And the main reason is that they want to bring the hostages home. That's a main a major concern of many Israelis, particularly, of course, of the parents and relatives of these hostages. And that's what the ceasefire agreement would do. There was an earlier one, just a few months into the war, that brought many of those hostages home. But that was after that. Every ceasefire or potential ceasefire agreement was really torpedoed by Netanyahu. It may be, I don't think he really had any interest in it himself. But even if he did, again, he had to deal with the extremists in his cabinet, and he couldn't afford to lose them. Apparently, he can now. But it brings up an interesting question, because the thing is, Smotrich and Ben Gvir and what they represent isn't going away. If they are pushed out of the government, what are they going to do? And especially when they had their sights set on Gaza, in particular northern Gaza, I think it was clear that the Israelis were intending to just completely um, cleanse northern Gaza, kill or drive away all the Palestinians there. And northern Gaza, so it's been a free fire zone pretty much for the last few months. And I think the intention was, and this is something that was stated, like within Israeli publication, was to actually start settling northern Gaza. just, making it de facto part of greater Israel. And there is like there are already movements and organizations that are poised to do this. And these people, again, are not going to go away. They are a real force within Israeli society. We saw what happened. Like, there was that riot outside the detention facility. And the soldiers backed down. This is a kind of there are militias that are not under the control of the Israeli government. So we'll see. If this actually goes ahead, Ben Gvir, Smotrich, they resign. I don't think they're going to be quiet. They're going to really wreak havoc. See what they can do, and we'll see what kind of how strong the Israeli government and the IDF is, and if they're able to keep a lid on things. But it's going to be a challenge.
Can we kind of assume that there's almost kind of a split within Israel where, for example, we have, 800,000 settlers in the West Bank? I forget how many there are.
Right. Now, one thing is to remember that a lot of those settlers are not ideological zealots. Some of them are. A lot of them are just people looking for cheap, properties. I mean, that's really, for maybe half of the settlers there, it's an economic decision. They, that's why they live in those settlements in the West Bank, because it's a lot cheaper than in other parts of Israel. But there are the zealots. They are a considerable proportion of them. There's no question about it.
Right, because I remember seeing a video, I believe it was Ben Gvir or Smotrich, I forget which one, just handing out M16s to settlers.
Yeah.
Like, here's an M16 for you, M16 for you. And I'm thinking, is it almost kind of fair to say at least part of the settler movement is really under the control of Ben Gvir and Smotrich? They're not really taking orders from the Israeli state, Netanyahu. Is that fair?
I think that is fair. Yeah, I think, that is fair. So that's a potential fissure, or already is a fissure that exists within Israeli society and in Israeli politics. And it could, I think that's why some people sometimes even, put forth the possibility of a civil war. I don't think it's actually impossible, because these people know what they want, and they see like it's within their grasp. And I don't think they have never backed down before. Well, maybe that's not quite fair. The one time that they did back down, but there was a lot of wailing and gnashing of teeth, was when the Israelis pulled completely out of Gaza in the early 2000s. And there were some settlements, within Gaza at that time, and they were pulled out. But there weren't very many. And I think this time it's going to, again, it's just like they feel like, hey, Netanyahu probably promised, these settlements, northern Gaza to them. And they're not going to be happy at all about ceasefire. Now, there's always a chance that there's really not much of an intent on the Israeli side to abide by the provisions of the ceasefire agreement. We've seen that, of course, in Lebanon, where they've really been breaking it since day one. So it may be that it's somewhere down the road, the Israelis are just going to break it. They'll find an excuse and they're just going to go back in. But maybe they feel for various reasons, political and otherwise, they just need a breather, and they're going to go along with it for at least the next few months.
Okay. So you're saying that if there is a ceasefire, these radical elements, the settler movements, the Ben Gvirs and Smotriches and their followers are not going to disappear. So there is a real possibility that even though the ceasefire is agreed, that we have kind of a rogue faction within Israel with the potential to do something like start something up in the West Bank, potentially blow up something like the Al-Aqsa Mosque would be the most extreme thing of starting something, but the wish is to annex. And so this is often what we kind of see the Israeli pattern is that, they got a ceasefire deal in Lebanon. A week later, Syria falls. That it gives them a reprieve to focus their attention somewhere else. So there is that possibility.
Yeah, well, again, that's actually very possible that it may be that this deal was made under pressure from Trump, because though Trump is an extreme Zionist, I think he's never really liked this war. He feels that and I think he's completely correct about this, even from, very much from a Zionist perspective, that this war is hurting Israel. I remember him making comments to that effect, a few months ago. Um, so, perhaps Trump applied pressure. And I would like to point out that actually pressure from Trump is probably um, something that just it's much more significant to the Israelis than pressure from Biden ever was. It was something that they could safely ignore whatever Biden said or did, or that his threats meant nothing to them. But I think Trump's, if he had in fact threatened the Israelis, and we don't know if he did or not, but I think he may have. He may have actually pressured them. They have to take him seriously, and the reason is that he placed himself really to the most extreme Zionist position on the political spectrum. He made himself out to be a Zionist, more Zionist than Biden. Biden was like a secret Hamas supporter or something, which is completely absurd. Of course, Biden just did everything the Israelis wanted, but that's not how Trump portrayed him. And so he also has his bona fides. I mean, he delivered during his first term to the Zionists. He gave them, official recognition of the annexation of the Golan Heights, the transfer of the embassy to Jerusalem, the Abraham Accords. He really delivered and did things that previous presidents, though they all were very, very friendly to the Zionists, never dared to do. So he's got the bona fides. And so he's not vulnerable in the way that Biden was. It's kind of ridiculous, of course, that Biden was vulnerable. But he was afraid of being attacked as being too sympathetic to Hamas or whatever, which was completely absurd. But those attacks seemed to work. He was constantly we say, vulnerable on his right flank. But Trump doesn't have a right flank. And so he does have a little bit more freedom to maneuver, to actually kind of extract a concession in the bargaining that goes on between the U.S. and Israel. So, Netanyahu just couldn't, blow him off the way that he would have Biden. Just say, get out of here. He couldn't do that. He just realized it's just that it's much harder to apply the screws back in the United States on Trump, because nobody's going to really believe that Trump is soft on Hamas or anything. It's a little bit like, it used to be said, like when I was growing up, that only Nixon could go to China. And, the reasoning behind that statement is just that Nixon was a well-known anti-communist going way back in the 1950s. And, he was always one of the most zealous anti-communists and accusing his opponents of being soft on communism and all that. So he had, proven himself to be, a firebrand anti-communist. So when he made the decision to actually reestablish relations with communist China, he wasn't vulnerable on his right flank, that, the way that almost any other politician might have been, or, especially a Democrat. A Democrat could not have done it. So you have this kind of strange paradox that sometimes it's the so-called, right-wing extremists that can actually make a peace deal. And then the dovish left-leaning people, well, again, at least I'm talking about kind of the old days. These days, it's not clear who's really dovish or something, but somebody who's dovish is less able to do that because he'll be condemned. He's soft. He's been taken in. We always knew that he was a secret communist or whatever. That's the kind of position that Trump is in. But you were just pointing out how with the Lebanon ceasefire was followed by the attack in Syria, and quite possibly those two events were coordinated. So there may be, we don't know what kind of deals are being made behind the scenes, but it may be that I'm sure that Netanyahu, the kind of guy he is, he's going to try to get something out. If he makes a concession, he wants to get something for it. And so maybe he's getting assurances about, a future attack on Iran. That's just speculation, but I think that's certainly possible.
Do we know what the provisions of the ceasefire are? What the details are?
Well, we know some. I think it's going to be take place in stages. And the main thing is that Israel is going to withdraw from Gaza, first from northern Gaza, and then they're going to start to allow civilians to come back in. It'll cease to be a free fire zone. It happens, like every 2 days or something. Israel's supposed to do something, Hamas is supposed to do something. So Hamas starts releasing the hostages, just maybe a few at a time. And Israel pulls back and then begins allowing more aid to flow in, which is, of course, very important. This is a population that's been starving. Hopefully, eventually it becomes a permanent ceasefire. That's the idea. It's, they're supposed to build confidence in each other step by step. But if everything goes according to plan, according to the promises, then we could have a permanent ceasefire. Of course, nothing's ever permanent. We've had permanent ceasefires in Gaza in the past, and then just every once in a while, the Israelis would decide to mow the lawn, as they put it, to just launch a number of attacks on Gaza. And I'm sure that's going to happen again.
So are you hopeful that this ceasefire will hold, that this will be a good thing, a welcome development in the Middle East?
Yeah, well, it's hard not to, if you're just, I don't know. It's a hard thing to, it's not a solution. That's the thing. It's just okay, the Israelis did this. There's nothing to prevent them from doing it again. And they just may just have decided that, okay, they want to focus on Iran. Maybe that's what's going on. Or they just have to give their soldiers a rest because it has been, obviously it's done enormous damage to Gaza and the people there and Hamas too, I'm sure. But it's also been hard on the IDF. They have suffered casualties, significant casualties, and they're having reservists are refusing to show up when they're called up for duty, and maybe they just think they need a rest and a time to rebuild. I mean, that may be a possibility. But the problem is that it's, even if you call it a permanent ceasefire, it's not a permanent solution. Because we have the same people, we have Israel remains an expansionist power, and it will continue to have its eyes on Gaza. And there will be those people who are never going to let up. Again, we've talked about, the Smotriches and the Ben-Gvirs. They're going to be constantly shouting and say, we've been betrayed and this land is ours. We had it, and then you gave it away. And that's going to be, we'll see. But I think that pressure is never going to end. And I think eventually Israel is going to go back in. Or there's a very, very great risk of it. It's a question of really when. Will it be soon? Will they break this within a few months, or will it be a couple of years down the line? I don't know.
Right. I just imagine if we have a ceasefire, a long-lasting ceasefire, it's going to be bad for the Israelis in terms of that. What they've done in Gaza is, I think by all definitions, is a genocide, or at least an attempt of a genocide. So you've committed half a genocide, and then you stop. And then if there is a ceasefire and there's a chance for people to rebuild, hopefully there's a chance for some foreign aid to come in to help.
Right. I think that's supposed to be part of it, yeah.
Right, and so then I think there might start to be an accounting because of the death toll. Because what we've seen happen is basically the numbers just kind of stopped at 45,000 casualties, and that's the number we report. But we know that they've destroyed every single hospital in Gaza. That there's no, and then basically the accounting stopped because there's no facilities or infrastructure to even process this, and so many people are buried under the rubble. Right. So if it stops and people come in and they start uncovering this and rebuilding, I think we're going to see this death count just start to explode, and I think that's going to be very damning for the Israelis, as well as the ICJ is going ahead with its the genocide court ruling will come out eventually.
That's all very true. And interestingly, a report came out from a British publication. I believe it was The Lancet. A study was done by a British medical school of some kind, and they estimated that the actual direct death count. Remember this. I think now that like the Gaza public health authorities have pegged the number at something like 46,500, and but they themselves they say at least. That's what they know. That what they've been able to count and verify. And this British publication says that they estimate that it's considerably more. We're talking about the direct death count. We're not talking about indirect deaths, which should be a significantly larger number. So, if they're right, it would be something like 70,000 direct deaths. And that may very well be true. Now, remember, it's something like typically in a war, for every direct death, that means, somebody that's been killed by a bullet or a bomb, fired by the enemy. There are from 4 to 15 times as many indirect deaths, because of the destruction of facilities like, hospitals and, a lack of access to clean water, and insufficiency of food and all those things. In general, deaths rise within the civilian population significantly. And actually in wars, typically more, the greater number of deaths are these kind of deaths. So I think that if in fact a ceasefire agreement is reached, and aid organizations can go in, they can actually start to figure out what really happened and how many people have died, start counting heads and find, how much the population has dropped. And then we may get a sense, now we have this 46,000 figure, which is horrifying in itself, but it's just the tip of the iceberg. I think that's what we're going to find out. And you're right, when those statistics come out, that's going to be very much to the detriment of Israel. I mean, Israel's public image is already rock bottom, but it's only going to get worse.
Right. We talked about this before, that Israel's really put itself in between a rock and a hard place, because you can't just commit half a genocide. You can't just say, oops, we got a little carried away, and walk away from it. And, then in their mind, they might think that the only way out is to go all the way through with it, which is terrifying as well.
Which is clearly the way many Israelis think. And it may be the way Netanyahu thinks, and it may be what he plans to do. It just may be this is a temporary concession that he felt like he had to make.
Right. I just don't... Yeah, I don't know how to feel about the ceasefire. Obviously the suffering of the Palestinians and the death, you want it to stop. But
right.
At the same time, it just doesn't feel satisfying. And I know I'm not in a position really to say, but it's just, I don't believe that it's going to last. Like you said, the problems still exist. But maybe this is the best thing because, like we said, it could allow for aid agencies to come in, uncover the atrocities, to expose Israel even further, and hopefully there will be some type of justice reached on, with the ICJ or something. I mean, I don't know. Is there a possibility for a two-state solution? Can it be forced by the UN? I mean, that's really the only solution, right?
The problem is, I know that's like the official position of all kinds of countries. We support the two-state solution, including Russia. Well, even the U.S. pretends, that it's in favor of this two-state solution, but clearly that's been its position for decades and decades, ever since the 1967 war. But it clearly has had, it's its official position, but its de facto position is just to support Israel, whatever it does, even as, Israel clearly undermines the possibility of a two-state solution. At this point, like we've said, I just don't see it happening because, like in the West Bank is just completely riddled with the settlements. With settlers, we have 800,000 of them, and they're everywhere. The tentacles have been, just penetrated deep into the West Bank, into every corner of the West Bank. And it's just not going to be possible. Again, not everybody there is a zealous, an extreme Zionist. They clearly are all Zionists of one kind or another, or how do you justify living there? But many of them are, like I've said, are just interested in a good deal. Some of those people could be moved out, but the ideological settlers won't. They will start a civil war if you try to move them out. I think that's really what you're looking at. It's just not it just can't be done.
Hmm. What about the other members of the Axis of Resistance? How they feel about this? Like, will this mean that the Houthis stop, or because the ceasefire between Lebanon and Israel is supposed to end soon? Does that mean that, well, if there's a ceasefire within Gaza, does that mean that the Axis of Resistance stops? No more Yemeni missiles, no more skirmishes with Hezbollah?
Well, it was my understanding that Hezbollah was demanding a ceasefire, and so that I think you could say that their conditions were met. If you stop bombing our brothers, we will stop bombing you. I think that's uh, the way they've always looked at it. The way those are the conditions that they set forth. So yeah, I would expect that attacks on northern Israel would stop if the ceasefire holds. Um, yeah, we'll have to see.
Yeah, I guess we'll just have to wait and see if it actually holds, if it's even reached, and then are they going to really allow aid in and start, and if things start to uncover, because I mean, they've been using starvation as a method of warfare against the people of Gaza. That's one of the lined out in the ICC warrant against Netanyahu. So yeah, I just don't see it. It just doesn't feel like you can just stop, that it can just end, and
Yeah,
maybe it
I'm
can,
afraid it
but
has to be temporary, and it's just a question of how temporary it's going to be. It's not, the forces, the expansionist forces in Israel aren't going away. I think they've been greatly empowered by all this, and they felt like they had, like Gaza in their sights. They were about to seize it. They were getting ready to move in. I think, and quite literally plans were being drawn up for new settlements there. And they're just not going to take this lightly.
right, yeah, okay. Well, we'll see what happens. I guess fingers crossed for a ceasefire. I just don't feel hopeful of the result. I just, even if there is one, I just don't trust the Israelis at this point. It's
Yeah.
hard. Um, okay,
Well,
well
I
let's.
know that one reason why these negotiations have taken a long time is Hamas doesn't trust the Israelis either. So, like the Israelis have said, for example, okay, yeah, we'll withdraw to this point. And he said, Hamas, for example, is demanding that, okay, you mark it on a map here. Because there will be some sort of, later they'll say, well, reinterpret the language some way that's favorable to Israel. So we didn't mean, out of all this territory. This part is, well, whatever, they'll come up with some sort of excuse. No, I said, we have a map, we draw the lines, you have to get behind these lines. I think that's actually what's happening. And apparently the Israelis are finally agreeing to those demands.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll see. Okay, let me move over to something else. What is your take on Elon Musk? How do you feel about him? He's been getting very political,
Yeah.
and there's been a lot of European leaders that are upset. There's talks of banning Twitter and saying stop interfering in our elections and our politics. What's your take on all that?
Well, I have very mixed feelings about him. I guess, overall, I I like him more than I dislike him. He seems like he's a real person. Let's put it that way. Kind of like Trump is. Even when some of the stuff he says is nutty or wrong, and but he doesn't. He's not afraid to say it. He's not afraid to go against the establishment. I guess you got that kind of money. You would think that would be typical of a multi-billionaire, but most of these multi-billionaires are actually amazingly kind of sycophantic towards the establishment. They don't seem to have an original idea in their heads, but he does. He has all kinds of ideas, and some of them are great, and some of them aren't. But he speaks them. So I kind of just admire him for being a loose cannon, and not being afraid to speak his mind. And I think, most of the time he's right. Clearly, like, for example, I strongly disagree with him on Israel. He's been very much a pro-Zionist. Um, um, and Twitter really has changed, I think, for the better, now X, since he took over, that it is freer. It's imperfect. There are still people being banned who shouldn't be banned. And I think, for example, like pro-Palestinian groups have had some trouble under him. but all in all, it's a freer place. He is serious about free speech. He's not, you can point to some hypocrisies. Yeah, it's there, and he deserves a criticism. But all in all, I think he has been a free speech advocate, and one who's, put his money where his mouth is. Now, about his criticisms of European governments, well, and the anger, he said, he's got a right to express his opinion. You got a right to ignore him or respond. I don't see how that's really interference. He can say whatever he wants. If you want to find interference, well, if he's using X, to try to manipulate elections or whatever, but nobody's actually come forward with those kind of charges. So this interference charge seems to me bogus, and it's also clearly inconsistent too. Because it's because he's on the wrong side of the establishment on these issues that they're mad at him. If he was supporting the establishment and its programs the way that Soros, another multi-billionaire, has, who really has tried to involve himself in elections, like he certainly has in the United States, where he'll fund, give lots of money to, for example, local DA elections, and he's been able to change laws in major cities because of that. Clearly, he's trying to affect the outcome of elections, and it's more than speech. In fact, he doesn't get out there and say much of anything. He's strategically, allocating money to different campaigns, to different candidates. And he's also built up these organizations, what we've talked about, color revolutions, for example, in Eastern Europe. Soros is almost always involved in these color revolutions. He trains people, he teaches them how to protest, and what kind of signs to hold up, and he pays them. That clearly is interference, but I don't see anybody, none of these European leaders complaining about that. It's just because they're all on the same side. Now you have, a multi-billionaire that's criticizing you, and to my knowledge, he's not doing anything like Soros is doing. He's not actually, really trying to involve himself in elections in these countries. He's just expressing his opinions. So, I say, tough luck. He's a rich guy with a big platform and a big, a megaphone, and you're just going to have to put up with him.
Right. Yeah, I mean, with Soros, it's feels more insidious because it's kind of covert, hidden. Yeah. It's not out there. Like you said, Elon is expressing his opinions. He has a huge megaphone, but he had that mouthpiece because of what he's achieved with his companies.
Right.
He was the one of the top 5 Twitter users before he acquired Twitter. So he already had that following. It's not like he acquired Twitter.
He didn't have to acquired Twitter to have that megaphone. You're right.
Right. Yeah, I think there's just something, just with billionaires, it's hard for people to, it seems like they're not supposed to get involved, that but at the same time, if you think about it rationally.
But they are involved, that's the thing. It's the
number
one donors on both, sides of the aisle are these multi-billionaires. We know the Adelsons, Saban over on the Democratic side, and they're Zionists too. It explains a lot of our politics.
Right. I mean, it actually, I guess if you look at it, the value, the net worth value, when you see people like Elon Musk, hundreds of billions of dollars, that's tied to their stock value, which in a way is really the trust that society has put into this person, into this company. So in a sense, it is kind of democratic if you look at it that way. But yeah, it's just kind of interesting seeing somebody, because like you said, most of the time billionaires aren't openly expressing their opinions, but they're actually funding lobbyist groups or creating institutions. They're not out there actually, saying their opinions, but they're got their fingers in a bunch of little pots and doing things, I'm kind of wondering if, when I think about Elon and what's happening here, is if he's just an important cog in this battle against the deep state, and if we should really be viewing the world, the right framework to be viewing the world is that we're in a battle against the deep state, the Western establishment of authoritarianism. Is that how we should kind of be framing things? How do you view the world in that sense?
Well, I think clearly there is. I would say maybe the monumental battle of this time is one between the Western hegemonists on one side, and then the advocates of a multipolar world on the other side. That's and these different local wars. Clearly the Russia-Ukraine war, fits into that. It's the globalists support Ukraine, and the multipolar advocates increasingly support Russia. Um, yeah, I don't know if you can. There are always local issues, but it's a lot. Certainly when it comes to foreign policy, that seems to be the great rift. That's just the big issue of the time. Um, Now, yeah, these these globalists tend to have, similar domestic policies too, right? So you find that, so it does extend to domestic policies to a great extent. I mean, it's not just, you can't completely divorce it from um, the foreign policy. They tend to have a kind of a unified view, the Western hegemonists. So of course, they're in favor of Western hegemony, but they're also in favor of, let's say, woke policies too. I mean, that seems to be um, kind of de rigueur with among the globalists. I really can't think of an exception.
Would you
And
classify?
yeah, they also tend to be also in favor of like very lax immigration controls, to give you an example. So these are all things that are very important to them. And so you find it, just take one example in France. It's just that, we have the National Rally, that's Marine Le Pen's group, her party. Yeah, they're for ending this, first, establishing good relations with Russia and in general with other non-Western powers, opening themselves up to the multipolar world. But then also, they're in favor of immigration restrictions, and they're attacked. They're considered fascists for some reason, for both of those things. And I think you'll say very much the same thing with the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's party, even though that's on the left. It's also true of her party as well. So that seems to be kind of where the lines are drawn. It's sort of like, again, there are all kinds of different local flavors. That's the thing about multipolarity, right? Yeah, you go to India, it's a Hindu civilization. China's a Confucian civilization. Russia is a an Orthodox Christian civilization, and so on and so forth. And then, there are within Western Europe, there are, the different countries have their own values and their sense of what's important, their own identities. So there is a great deal of diversity on the multipolar side, just by necessity. They're multipolar, right? But they're all fighting this one kind of this unified vision that the globalists have, the Western hegemonists have, which it's not just foreign policy, but also certain kinds of domestic policies.
Would you classify Trump and Elon in this fight between the Western hegemonists and the multipolar world? What camp would you put them in?
Uh, yeah, well, yeah, it's a little bit tough. I don't think it's Trump is not a true, again, like you say, a neocon. I don't think he's really interested in the ideology. But he does love American power, and so I think he doesn't want to see America losing any wars. At the same time, of course, he doesn't really seem to be eager to start them. Um, yeah, like if Trump had his druthers, he probably would invade Greenland, reacquire the Panama Canal and all that. He likes it. Clearly, I think that's his vision of himself, is just expanding American power, where he can. But he's not interested in the ideological crusade. He's actually not interested in Western hegemony per se. The thing is that he's the president of the United States, and like the U.S. government is like one great machine that's committed to Western hegemony, to this vision. So you know, we'll just see. Will Trump be able to kind of break free and then pursue his own vision? I don't think so. It's just based on all kinds of past presidencies, not just his own first term. But I think his natural instincts place him somewhere else. He actually would probably be comfortable in a way with a multipolar world, and he say, North America is our pole. This is
Right.
our sphere of influence.
Right. I was kind of thinking Panama,
Right.
Canada, Greenland. This is all the idea of our sphere of influence, the Monroe Doctrine. So
Right.
it's crude. I don't necessarily agree with it, but
right.
it's a bit more rational, I guess, than.
And it's
but
actually more limited. I mean, it's just like I think it was Alexander Mercouris pointed this out, I think it was a very nice turn of phrase. It's just say for Donald Trump, the sphere of influence is North America, but for the Western hegemonists, the sphere of influence is the entire globe. And so, that's in the end, I wouldn't be in favor of invading Panama and taking the canal. I think that would be wrong. It would, I don't think it almost certainly is not going to happen. But in fact, even if he did that, he pursued that kind of a crude, militaristic policy within North America. It would be less damaging to the world, much less damaging to the world than what the globalists are doing. Again, it's just that they're going all the way around the world, to places like Taiwan and Ukraine and fomenting wars with other great powers. And, we've seen the consequences. They're really quite horrific. Now, of course, one blind spot that a lot of these people like Elon Musk and Trump have is Israel. So there's that, they unfortunately, they just refuse to actually differentiate Israeli interests from U.S. interests. I mean, if he was a true MAGA, you would put America first, and America's interests often are not Israeli interests, and they collide. And so this is one place where they have not been consistent, and where they actually do support expansionism on the other side of the globe.
Is there ever an instance where Israeli interests are American interests?
At the present time, not really. I think, Mearsheimer's right that Israel is a huge liability to the U.S. I think it had some value, like back during the Cold War days. It's just a counterweight to Soviet influence in the Middle East. But, those days are long gone.
So do you think there's a possibility that Trump, maybe in his talks with Putin, is able to recognize the movement to the multipolar world and agree to it? And even if Trump is talking about, Greenland and Panama, Canada, it's like Russia would be like, that's your sphere of the world. You guys back out of Europe, because Europe is becoming this, it's between the United States and Russia and China, these two powers. It is the buffer zone. It's dangerous how much influence the United States has in our encroachment towards this other huge sphere of power. We need some distance. That's what Mearsheimer says.
Yeah. Well, you're saying again, it's just like, and that's what, of course, the Russians were asking for. They had no desire to invade Ukraine. Again, Putin made that clear. Even after the SMO began, he was immediately proposing neutrality and offering to remove his troops from, the territory that they had just invaded. Because if neutral countries are buffer zones, and there was a time when our own government recognized that. For example, I know that Eisenhower was all in favor of neutral countries between the East and the West, between the Soviet Union and Western Europe. He saw that reduced the chance of conflict, and it was good for both sides. We've just lost that. We've become that wisdom. We've lost that wisdom, and we're now global hegemonists and Western supremacists, basically, that just cannot abide by any sort of rival power, cannot abide the existence of any rival power.
Yeah, I mean, that's the scariest thing for me, is this idea that we have to have primacy. And you hear that language, Mitch McConnell was saying that, we need to ensure American primacy in the world. And we have over 800 military bases around the world. It's like, can you retract that, or does it have to come down to some type of showdown where we have, the challenger is going to come up, which is Russia and China, and in my opinion, these in Iran, these powers combined definitely can defeat the American empire, whatever we throw at it, and it would be catastrophic for the world if it happens. But it's just like we are the old lion, with our pride, and there's young upstarts. Our time is done. The the age of primacy is over. But we're not even saying that there's going to be a new head of this pride. We're saying that it's going to be a multipolar one. You have your own area, we have our own area. And if we fail to recognize that and allow that to happen, then kind of what you're telling me is that we're headed for some type of inevitable clash, or maybe just some type of collapse instead of a clash, that it just kind of breaks apart like the Soviet Union did. We never had a clash with the Soviet Union. It just broke apart. Could we see the same thing happen with the Western hegemonists? The American empire just collapsed like the Soviet Union did without having to start a massive global war.
Yeah, well, yeah, there are all kinds of possibilities. I'm not going to, I don't have a crystal ball. I mean, it's clear, there are certain trends that are obvious and will continue into the future. And I think one is one trend is the rise of the multipolar world. Every year that world becomes larger and stronger. And I think that that's just the inevitable trend. And the rest of the world sees it and is starting to shift their allegiance towards that new world. And then on the other hand is, Western hegemony. It's on its way out. It's in decline, relative decline anyway. But how that's going to play out, I just don't pretend to know. I don't have a crystal ball. Will it, end in a conflagration? I mean, it's possible. We've seen that just sort of been a lashing out and a refusal to accept, this decline gracefully. They could, again, as we said many times, the leaders of the West could just accept this multipolar world and actually do very well in it. They've become part of it and become like one of the most important pillars within this new edifice, and it would be, and prosper because of it. It would especially be good for Europe, because at the present time, Europe has made itself just entirely dependent on the United States. It's rejected the multipolar vision. It's embraced the hegemonic vision. And as a result, it really has, it's made itself just utterly dependent again on the U.S. By cutting itself off from Russia and China and from these other powers, it's lost any kind of bargaining position or any options that it might have. It's just it simply has to accept American dictates. And so we've seen the consequences. We're witnessing the deindustrialization of Europe. It's been very, very detrimental to Europe. It's actually kind of painful to watch. Again, there are a few parties that are waking up and are ringing the alarm bells about it within Europe, but they still don't have power. The thing is, like within the U.S., you still have maybe somewhat analogous to what you have in Israel. You have these. I think the problem is, much more pronounced in Israel. The peoples that are Zionism is such a powerful force, and it's just sort of a question of how extreme a Zionist you are. But in the U.S., it's kind of accepted that we're supposed to be number one. Like every politician that runs for office always has to repeat those things. Like, we're the greatest country in the world. Yeah, and we will remain so, or we're, and nobody's saying that, maybe we should actually kind of accept this new world. Things have changed since the end of World War II. That was really a very unusual set of circumstances. Much of the world have been laid to waste by the wars. But here, on the North American continent we were unscathed, and so we just had this huge advantage, an economic and political advantage over most of the world for that time. But that was what 80 years ago, and the world has changed. There's just no longer the same kind of imbalance of power. And the balance, and it's nothing like the 1990s again. That was kind of another unipolar moment, right? That's what called it back then. But that was 30 years ago, and the world has changed a lot since then. And we need to accept it. But we have people. It just seems like this belief in American supremacy, American exceptionalism is kind of like a religion, a political religion in this country. And just as it makes compromise almost impossible with Zionism, the devotion to Zionism makes compromise impossible within Israel. This devotion to American exceptionalism makes it hard for us to compromise and to deal with reality, and to maybe gracefully retire from our position of primacy. And again, it would be very good. So we could remain a great power for centuries if we wanted to, and prosper. But the thing is that we're in the grips of this vision, of us as essentially, the ruler of the world, that we have our sphere of influence, and it is the globe, and we're just not able to accept anything else. That is clearly just unsustainable. And we are trying to maintain it, and it's doing, at great cost. Again, it's damaged the reputation of the dollar, which is, one of the main fundamental pillars on which our power stands, and it's clearly damaged that. But then it's also, put us in conflict with, one of the great powers, that's Russia, and and it can potentially put us in conflict with China, with Iran, and if we continue down this path, we're going to find ourselves on the losing side, I think, of a world war. We could go that way, That's
okay. I think that's a good place to end. Something to stew upon.
Okay.
Let's hope we don't go down that path, that great war, but it is here. Okay. All right. Thanks a lot, Dad. Have a good rest of your day.
You too.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.